And so one big point I'd like to make about that video, so tonight I really want to talk about, okay, if you learn how to do this well, how do you traverse an industry that's trying to stop you from doing it? Because that's what's happening. It's been happening, it's going to happen because there's a lot of money at stake. How do you do it so it benefits you instead of the industry? And so tonight we'll talk about that, and it's going to be the review on asset allocation and how to keep this simple, at low cost, allocated appropriately for your situation. So a bit of a review from last week. Identify your goals. Make sure you know exactly what you're doing this for. Your time horizon. Are you trying to make it all the way for your entire life? Or are you investing for your kids, your grandkids? Your risk tolerance. You know exactly how much can you handle when markets go down. Your tax situation, because it's going to change. What are your income needs, maybe in retirement? You know, you identify where all that liquid cash is. Make sure you get the whole number for the entire portfolio. Make sure you look everywhere. Get that grand total. And if you're married, get the spouse's grand total. What is the family grand total? An example, right? Somebody came up and had a $400,000 total because they looked in their 401k, their Roth, maybe an old traditional IRA. Maybe they got some money in a cash value whole life policy. Maybe they got money sitting in the bank. Could have some savings bonds. They might even have a little money in the sock drawer. Add it all up. When they actually look at their allocations, it could be very low. And what we know is the higher allocations of stocks over time, your return has been dramatically higher. So in that case, this $350,000, because 50,000 of it's not even invested, paying 1.88%, which is a fairly low number, to be honest with you. It could be much higher. But in this case, running somebody $65.80 a year. Again, in terms, you think, well, that doesn't sound that bad, but it does. The idea is to get those allocations where you want them. What do you desire them to be? So one example, doesn't fit everybody, but one example, an 80-20 allocation. 80% stocks, 20% bonds and cash. You put that whole $400,000 into the market, stocks and bonds, money market, and you break that up in those kind of allocations. You diversify as much as you can. You own stocks in the US, you own stocks international. You might even own some REITs that are negative correlated. So stock in commercial real estate tends to go different than stocks in the large US companies. And you always remind yourself every dog has its day. One asset class is going to do better in one time period over another. We just don't know when. And then you rebalance on occasion in case your allocations get too far one way or another because markets went up, markets went down, or you're putting money in, or you're taking money out. Remember the stew, right? You put together the right amount of stew, the right components, you get yourself the right kind of portfolio. You take risky stuff, put it together with stuff that's less risky, and together it makes for a balanced portfolio. The right ingredients into a stew makes for just the right tasting stew. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. You get those costs as low as possible. So once you figure out those allocations, you're always finding ways to reduce the cost along the way, because costs are paramount to what those returns are going to be over time. So we saw what it was previously. That's what it could have been. So you're paying $240 on $400,000 instead of $64.80 on $350. There's your difference. And if you run that over 30 years, you're talking big numbers. You're talking big numbers because returns end up going down with a low allocation of stocks and a high cost, and they go up with a higher allocation of stocks and a low cost. And just in case somebody thinks, well, cash is good, well, no, cash is not good. Cash is going to be worth a whole lot less in the future. Inflation's going to eat it up. So by knowing your numbers and getting them right, you can put yourself in a better position going forward in your future life. And of course, always listen to that guy. When in doubt, listen to the greatest investor of our time. And if you have an advisor or a life insurance agent locally that are telling you a different story, ask yourself, who are you going to listen to? Them or him? I think that's an easy decision. So here we also want to talk about diversification, talk about high quality bonds, talk about negative correlated asset classes, and how to overweight to small and value. So I have a worksheet, and there's quite a few worksheets on there. And again, you can get this PowerPoint as well as the worksheets by sending me an email tomorrow. Okay, let's look at the worksheets. Okay, we're starting first. Gives you an idea of when you're investing in stocks, what are you investing in? You see how it's broken down by United States versus international over there in stocks? Large companies, mid, small, whether that's US or overseas. You see blend, that's a combination of growth companies and value. And what is growth? Well, growth companies tend to be companies that are expected to grow at a much greater rate. Value companies tend to be thought of as not growing at a very good rate. They could even be sick companies in some people's terms. And then you see it broken down by sectors. So you see the sectors of the US economy. 13 different sectors that stocks are part of in our US economy. And what you see highlighted there in yellow are ways in which you can overweight, own a little bit more of in a portfolio where historically you've gotten a little higher return with not much extra risk and actually lower volatility, which is ideal. If you can get lower volatility and slightly higher risk with quite a bit higher return in relation to that risk, that is something to consider. So we'll talk about overweighting tonight and why you might consider it. Do you have to do it? No. And again, overweighting, owning more of. So when you decide to own a small cap value index fund, separate from the total stock market index fund, you're choosing to own more small cap value because small cap value is contained within the total stock market index fund, for example. We look over here at bonds, same thing, United States, international, quality bonds versus junk bonds. Junk bonds are called high yield bonds in the industry because they have a hard time selling junk, but they don't have such a hard time selling high yield. You can see them as corporate or government bonds, short maturities, maybe a couple years, intermediate maturities, long maturities. What we know historically from years and years of research, there isn't much benefit by owning long-term maturities. So you want to focus on bond index funds that own short to intermediate term maturities within a bond fund. In other words, you get almost what you get from a long-term bond index fund at a much lower risk. And again, the yield can go up or down based off interest rates, and that's going to change over time. The default rate, the credit risk, again, that goes with junk bonds, corporate bonds that may not pay out. So there's a reason why a bond fund is paying a higher yield, because some of those bonds may not pay you. So you're taking more risk to get a higher yield, which is fine if you want to do that, but make sure you understand that. What I would tell you historically, it makes little sense to chase yield on bonds. If you're going to try to get higher risk to get higher return, you do it with stocks, not with bonds. The bonds are there to keep you afloat. High quality bonds keep you afloat, as we talked about last week, when stocks are going down. Junk bonds, they go down with stocks. They will not keep you afloat. So understanding kind of what lies in these funds, right? The sectors of economies, understanding how stocks are allocated, just gives you a better foundation on how to understand some of these topics. Okay, so hang in there, folks. This could be challenging, but it's important, and you might find this quite helpful. By reviewing it at a later date. So what we're looking at over here are the different kinds of funds. These are all basically markets that represent emerging markets, developed markets, large stocks in the US, small, and so forth, including bonds, including cash, including commodities. Expected return is basically past historical returns on those asset allocations, on those particular indexes. So if you look right there, and you notice how it's not in order, what I have in order here is the standard deviation, the volatility of those assets. So from the top going down to the bottom, you're going to see the most volatile down to the least volatile. So if you want to know what is the most volatile investments on big markets throughout the world, well, it's going to be overseas emerging markets. And what's next is going to be small cap growth stocks in the US, and then real estate in the US, and so forth. So going down that list, most volatile down to least volatile, which would be your short-term treasury bills in the US. So how do we kind of take this information and help us understand asset allocation? Let's take a look at the very first one, overseas emerging markets. Standard deviation is 29.65. What does that mean? That means if you add 29.65 to 14.35, you get 44%. You take 29.65 minus from 14.35, you get a minus 15.3%. In one standard deviation, i.e. two-thirds of the time, that's where emerging markets are falling. That's the return. It's going to fall between minus 15 and plus 44. One standard deviation. If you go across two standard deviations, which is 95% of the time, which is most of the time, those returns are going to fall between minus 45% basically and a plus 73%. That's where the emerging market's going to fall. And if you go to three standard deviations, which is almost all of the time, the returns are going to fall somewhere between, I can't quite get to that, minus 70-some%, or as high as 103%. Can I move this, baby? Okay, that's enough. So that gives you an idea. One standard deviation is two-thirds of the time. Two standard deviations, 95% of the time. Three standard deviations, almost all of the time. So when you went through emerging markets, the most volatile asset class out there when you're looking at big asset classes, you can start going down the way. And so now U.S. small growth stocks. It's not quite as volatile as the emerging markets. Look at the historical return. Let's highlight something here. Look at U.S. small value stocks. So the value stocks are 22.46% historically over long periods of time. So it's less volatile than U.S. growth small stocks, and yet the historical return is quite a bit higher. About 3.5% almost a year higher. So you're getting 3.5% a year more in a less volatile stock portfolio. So that is one example on why you would consider owning small cap value. So let's talk about that for a minute. Why would that be? I mean, why wouldn't everybody do that? Well, let's talk about small growth. What might fall into small growth? Well, the hot companies, the companies people love to talk about and analyze and trade. Could be Twitter, could be Tesla, it could be Uber or Lyft, whatever is hot, that's going to grow fast, even though it may have no earnings to it, it may not pay much of any dividend, it's amazing. Well, those amazing stocks are talked about, analyzed, and traded a lot through markets all over the world. The news media, you hear it all the time. On the other hand, small value isn't because it's not exciting. And maybe those companies are just kind of steady, or maybe they're not expected to do as well. So they tend to be underanalyzed, undertraded, and they outperform over time. So part of this is behavioral finance. The idea that human beings make some pretty poor decisions when it comes to investing their money. So take some time to think about that and to understand that understanding the standard deviation is important, but what is your risk-adjusted return? So in this case, small cap value gives you a better risk-adjusted return than small cap growth. And I'm talking about historically. Can that change from year to year? Yes, and it does change from year to year. But if you look at these kind of numbers over decades, those are the numbers you get. So let's scroll down some more. Let's look at commodities. Some people like to invest in commodities, gold, silver, 17.86%. So there's your standard deviation, not as high, but look at the historical return. It's putrid. Why would you take that kind of risk to get that kind of historical return? It makes no sense. The answer is you wouldn't. So when you see numbers like that, and they're historical numbers, it's very clear that investing in commodities other than what you own within a total stock market index fund is a mistake. You would not want to overweight to that because the numbers are working against you. Just like you would not want to overweight to small cap growth. Why would you want to own more of something that's higher risk and lower return? We can come down here to bonds. So high quality bonds, international quality bonds, US quality bonds. Standard deviation is a little bit higher, international, and yet the return's a little bit lower. Another reason why, personally, I don't invest in international high-quality bonds. Is there anything terribly wrong with it? No. But the numbers tell me I don't need to do it. I'll take a lower standard deviation and a slightly higher return on high-quality U.S. bonds. That's okay with me. And on occasion, international bonds are going to do better. I accept that. But historically, I'm okay with high-quality U.S. bonds. So that's another example of looking at historical numbers, looking at past returns, which do not tell us the future, but it gives us an idea, gives us a glimpse of what they could be, and how you would allocate over time. So again, when you take a look at this on your own time, in your own schedule, one standard deviation, simply add up the standard deviation to the expected return, and you're going to get the low end and the high end, 2/3 of the time. 95% of the time, almost all of the time. It gives you a glimpse of what risk is, of what return has been, and what it could be going forward. I know those are a lot of numbers. I know some of you are thinking, dude, I don't know about that. But, what I would tell you is, if you take the time to review this on your own schedule and spend a little time on it, their moment might come where you go, oh, I get what he's saying. Any questions on this particular worksheet? Talk about 80 years, 8 decades. And that's important when you're looking at these historical kind of numbers. You don't want to say, oh, over the last 5 years. That's a poor range. You don't want to do 10 years. I wouldn't want to do 20 years. I want to do something basically over 50 years. So if you can get any kind of data that covers more than 50 years, you're going to get the ups and downs of markets, the bulls and the bear markets. And that's a fair representation as you look at standard deviation over one asset versus another. You bet. So let's look at the small cap and value versus growth. The significance there is it makes the case that you would consider overweighting a portfolio to small cap value. I do that. I do it for research, and it's not my idea. Book up on it right in here. It's been known for a long time that small cap value has historically beat small cap growth, for example. And so if you're going to overweight, if you're going to own more of in a portfolio, you better have a good reason, rather than, well, I got a hunch. There's no hunch. If we're investing based off a hunch, we're doing something wrong. We should be investing based on past historical research and what we can try to anticipate based on that data. And then you can also look at real estate. A reason why you might overweight to real estate, and I do, is because the U.S. stock market, the total stock market index fund, let's say at Vanguard, about 4% of it is real estate. But about 10% of the U.S. market is actually real estate. In other words, not all of the real estate, the commercial real estate, is captured within the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. So if you own a REIT index fund separately from the total stock, you're going to get full representation of the real estate allocation in the U.S. market. And another plus, real estate tends to work a lot like high-quality bonds. They tend to go in a different direction than large capitalization stocks in the U.S. So those are two methods that personally I use based off research, based off the data, to overweight a portfolio. A little extra in real estate and small cap value. Do you have to do that? No, you do not. But what we know is from past experience, you've gotten a little better return without taking much extra risk, and the volatility has been lower. All of these you could think of as an index fund. Those are actually the markets. So these are not actually U.S. funds or international funds. This is the actual market. So emerging markets, it's the entire emerging market outside the U.S. There's no cost to it. It is the market. To own that fund in an index fund, let's say at Vanguard, it's going to cost you 0.14, and that's it. And then you're going to own that market. By the way, some of that data is not going to be 80 years old because that data is not that old. So emerging markets, developed markets, as we looked at last week, they're going to be lower amount of years of data simply because we have not been tracking them that long. So how does a person apply those factors to a portfolio, right? So, because partly we're talking about how to invest wisely, but how do you do it in the real world, right? How do you apply it in your portfolio? So, first of all, there's basically 6 factors that we want to consider. And by the way, you can put your cursor on any one of these, and it's going to give you an explanation of the factor. And you'll see the funds. The funds tell you they all have edited comments to help you understand what you own. Okay? So, 6 factors. The market. You want to own the market. Most of the return you're going to get is based on the market you own, number 1. So all the funds in this list are total markets, total stock market, the whole U.S. market. If you just want to focus on the 500 index, which is 75% of the U.S. market, okay, I prefer the total, but 500 index can work. Total international, that's the entire developed and emerging markets. If you want to own them separately, you can do that. Again, total market. So most of your return is going to come from the market. We know that. Next up is size. What we know from research, if you allocate to small cap, you're going to end up getting a slightly higher return as you take a little extra risk. And then when it comes to value, you add a little more to it. So real estate belongs in the small cap category. Could a person allocate to large cap value? Yes, they could. I've done that in the past. I don't do it anymore. Not because it's a bad idea, but because I really don't want to get very far away from owning the total market. So the only fund that I own that actually uses the factor method is a small cap value. Why is that? Because I'm using 2 things together, small and value. And by using those 2 together, I'm confident that over time, you're going to get a little more bang for the buck. Could I be wrong? Sure. Research says I'll be right, but research can't tell us the future. It can only tell us the past. Term and quality. That's in bonds. You want to keep maturity short or intermediate. So term, short-term bond is intermediates. Total bond is intermediates. Short-term bond is short. Total bond is intermediate. So if you're going to own bond funds and their quality, you want to own those 2 type of funds at a low cost. All of these it's a given that we're going to invest at low cost. That's a given. We know that if we squeeze out the cost, returns are going to get higher. We're just trying to figure out what kind of markets are we going to own? Are we going to allocate a little extra here or there? And what kind of bonds are we going to own to make sure we capture the quality and keeping those maturities at short or intermediate term. No long-term bonds. And again, long-term bonds, you take a little extra risk for a little bit more return. It's not worth the extra risk. We know this historically. Finally, momentum. And this is a tough one. So we know from, again, past historical returns, using momentum has actually provided higher returns with your portfolio. So they've started to create funds that are trying to use momentum, trying to use how some companies can keep going for longer periods of time and blah, 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 and I'm not convinced. So I believe it's a work in progress. I personally would not invest in a momentum factored fund. The way I personally try to capture that is by rebalancing. So if you use the threshold method, right, and I do, I rebalance from 80 to 70 or 90 if it hits those numbers. Otherwise, I let my funds go. By letting your funds go, instead of rebalancing every year, I'm allowing momentum to happen within a portfolio. So historically, I'll get a little bit extra return as I let momentum take hold either on the good and sometimes on the bad. Now, what about the bad? Well, markets go up about 75% of the time. So I'm going to ride those markets up, and on occasion, I may ride those markets down. But I'm going to let momentum ride in my portfolio until I rebalance, again for me, at 90% or 70%. Again, that's something for you to consider. Are we going deep here? Yes, we are. This is not for beginners. But see, you guys aren't beginners anymore, right? This is information that you can use to better understand the portfolio you have and maybe the portfolio you want. And so as you put these portfolios together, you're trying to capture those factors as best you can, focusing specifically on that market and then a little bit toward these others. Questions on this worksheet? Yes, sir. You bet. Short term, maybe 2 to 3 years. Intermediate, 5 to 10. Maybe more like 7 or 8 for intermediate would be an average. That's correct. When you start going beyond 10, you're getting into the long-term category. So for some funds, they'll go 10 to 30 designated as long-term. Because, by the way, when you have a bond mutual fund, you're going to have hundreds, maybe thousands of bonds in there with different levels of maturities. One may be 12, one may be 18, one may be 28. But you look at the average. You want that average below 10 for intermediate, and you want it down to 2 or 3 for a short-term bond. Yep. Damn straight I do. You betcha. You're just a step ahead. Okay. Any other questions? And again, this is another example. If you, here's what I would say, and because I know some of you are thinking, dude, you spend 3-4 hours on this, it's going to make more sense. Read the instructions, read the comments, study the information, and it will make more sense. Now, how you allocate your portfolio is going to be up to you, but I want you to at least have the knowledge to know that you have some options here based on what you now know. So here's an example of somebody with some buckets. Bucket 1 is an emergency account. Maybe it's a brokerage account. Bucket 2 would be a retirement account at work. Maybe it's a 401k, a 403b, a TSP, whatever. Bucket 3 is a Roth IRA. Bucket 4 is an old retirement account, maybe some old 401k or old IRA. And then bucket 5 might also be a non-retirement account that maybe you inherited some money, maybe you sold a home, you came into some cash. What would you do with that money? So in this case, a lot of people over time can start to accumulate these kind of buckets. And so then if you're deciding, let's say you got $300,000, and let's say you've decided that you want an 80-20 allocation. That's what you've decided on. And again, if you want 70-30 or 60-40, you can run the numbers. Then you simply decide how you're going to allocate them within those accounts. So why did I choose, for instance, to put the real estate and the small cap value in the Roth IRA? Well, they're two of my most risky funds. Real estate is not tax efficient. It always belongs inside a retirement account. And historically, those two funds will probably give me the best return on my money over time. So I'm accessing that money last because I'm thinking that money is going to compound for me at the highest rate of anything I own. So that's one reason. And I can break it up into the allocations that you see. And you see there, 24,000 in real estate, 24,000 small cap. That's 10% of my portfolio. 10% of 240,000. Now over there in the 401k, I'm putting most of my retirement money there, so I'm going to try to put that in a total stock market index fund, where I own the entire market. That's where I want most of my stock money, is in a total market fund, preferably U.S. And then over here, total international index fund, I still want a chunk in there because I want to own markets outside the U.S. And in this case, about 30% sounds about right. 30% of that 240,000. And that total international stock index fund is very tax efficient, something we will talk about in the coming weeks. You want low turnover funds inside your non-retirement accounts that produce very little in the way of short-term capital gains. So in this case, it has a turnover rate of 4%, which is awesome. And I know some of you are thinking, okay, dude, if you say so, I don't know what that means. 4% is awesome. You want a single-digit turnover rate. Again, we'll talk about this. That means almost all of the capital gains in that fund are going to be long-term capital gains. And I want long-term capital gains because when I pull it out later in my life, based on the current marginal tax brackets and the current long-term capital gains rate, it's likely I will pay a rate of, let me think here, 0. I don't know about you, but I like paying 0. So by understanding efficiency of one fund over another and understanding capital gains rates versus short-term versus long-term, you can allocate appropriately within your portfolio. And then let's go all the way back over here to my prime money market. It's my cash. So I'm younger than 59 and a half in this example. So I'm keeping my cash in there for my short-term needs that I can go get whenever I need it. For some kind of emergency, if I have a deductible I have to pay for an insurance policy, it's there. And now, of course, I'm in the contribution phase. So as I'm putting money in, I'm monitoring my allocations. So in an ideal world, I just put it together, set, but as I put money in, markets go up and down. These allocations change. We don't have to lose sleep over it, but we do have to acknowledge that it's not going to stay at 10% or 40 or 66% like you see that total bond. Because if you notice, the total bond and the prime equal this amount. That's your 20%. I want to keep my bonds inside a retirement account because they're not tax efficient. And again, we'll talk about that more in the future, but you want tax efficient funds in non-retirement accounts and tax inefficient funds like real estate, like bonds, in retirement accounts. And by the way, whether that was a single person or a married couple, you could still allocate in relation to those numbers and those kind of buckets. You could have 2 Roth IRAs. You could have 2 401ks. And of course, with the non-retirement accounts, they could be a joint account. So a retirement account is always an individual account. You identify beneficiaries. Non-retirement could be a joint account or individual based off circumstances. Questions on that? So this is just an example of what a bad 401k looks like. You know, they talked about it in the movie documentary there a little bit. So this is somebody's actual 401k. What you see on the left is their funds and what they're being charged. And what you see on the right are Vanguard index funds. They could be in the plan, but they're not. Now, over there to the left, why are they so expensive? Well, some of it could be revenue sharing. They tack on fees, basically charging the employees of the company for their own 401k plan, which personally I think is shameful, but it happens a lot. They call it a benefit. I don't think it's a benefit if you're paying for it. But this is an example right here of a high-cost index fund. So somebody might say, well, invest in index funds. Well, make sure those index funds are low cost, right? The same 500 index fund at Vanguard, right? You're paying 8 times the cost for the same fund over there. Why would anybody do that? So in this case, that's what a bad 401k looks like. If you've got one, I'd raise hell. I would try to get better options within that plan. And it is doable, and people do it.
Quick question about the last slide. That was, I thought you said something about how you want to keep cash.
Keep cash. In this example, it's somebody who's under age 59 and a half. So they're keeping their cash in a non-retirement account, right? If you're 59 and a half or older, you might consider keeping your cash in a retirement account. Keep it in your IRA, because then you can pull money out with no penalties. You could also keep your cash inside a Roth IRA. Some people do that, because you can pull money out of a Roth IRA at any point in your life, the contributions, with no penalties and no taxes. So there are different ways to basically slice the banana, but that's one. And if this gets a little confusing, I want you to know there's not one way to do this, but I am describing ways in which to slice this up that you figure out based off your circumstance. And I know it can be challenging, but the more you learn on this matter, the more it can make sense. That's why some of you have been here more than once. How many people have been in this class more than once? Look at all those hands, right? Why is that? Is it because they just are bored? No, they want to learn more, and they're adding to what they know. So the first time you get some of this, it's like, well, okay. Second time, it's like, oh. Third time, it's like, oh, yeah, okay. Because you're placing things together in your mind as you connect some dots. Yeah. It can vary, right? It can vary by employer, but sometimes they'll say, well, we'll address that during our yearly review. So sometimes that's a policy, which I don't like to hear that kind of talk, but yes. Talking to their HR, yes. Another method is you can help the HR and then they change the whole damn policy, which I'll show you here in a minute. So this is an example of a good 401k. So why is that? Well, I helped the HR lady. I told her her 401k sucked. And she's like, well, that's not good because I picked it. But she rather than getting defensive, she said, well, teach me. Tell me why it stinks. And I did. And she fired them, which was principal, by the way, and she hired Vanguard. And now all of those employees in that company have low-cost Vanguard index funds. She changed the lives of every single person in that employment. So can it be done? You're damn straight it can be done. This is McKenna. So it's an imaging company here in Waterloo, and she changed it. Yeah. And granted, she's the HR lady, but I've had multiple people in the area go to their HRs and either get funds added to their plan or get rid of their plan or add Vanguard index funds to their plan. So it's doable. And the more people you can get behind you to do that, the better off you're going to be. One example, here's you and I. So you and I have some good options, and they've got some crap. So again, let's just take a look at the very top. They have the equity index institutional. So institutional shares are lower cost shares than retirement share funds. So the one right beside it at 0.3 is the exact same fund. Think about that for a minute, okay? It owns exactly the same securities, it's total stock. So why would anybody put money in that at 6 times the cost of the other one? The answer is they just don't know. So there should be like no dollars in that at UNI, and there happens to be millions. So one, UNI should be ashamed of themselves for having that in the plan. But two, if people become educated, they would not have money in there. And they would understand the differences between the funds they have in the plan versus the options they have. And so if you don't have good options, right? So example is UNI does not have a good real estate option. Well, you take that money, you invest in real estate in your Roth IRA or in an outside old IRA that you moved over from some previous employment. You find ways to hold different asset classes in other accounts if your employer doesn't offer them in your plan.
Without needing an employer?
Correct.
You transfer your funds to your family?
Yep, so it's going to vary. Employers have their own policies on when you can move money out while still employed. Some will tell you 59 and a half. So if you're under 59 and a half, almost never, right? You're going to have to be at least 59 and a half. Some will tell you it has to be age 62, some 65, some 70 and a half, which I think is ridiculous. I personally think 59 and a half is a fair number, but your employer is going to set the rules in the way they set that agreement up when they set up the plan. Okay, so if you move that money over, you could move $500,000 into an IRA just fine. That has nothing to do with your contribution limits. So you could still put $7,000 for somebody 50 and over into an IRA or Roth IRA for that year and still do a transfer of a large chunk of money. That's correct. That is correct. That transfer does not count toward any kind of contribution limit. Yep. That is correct. So if you move money from 401k that's traditional, pre-tax, to an IRA, you're still going to have the same rules. Can't pull it out until 59 and a half. Once you pull it out at 59 and a half, you'll pay tax on it because it's never been taxed. That's correct. And if you have a Roth 401k, move that to a Roth IRA and some even better rules with the Roth IRA. Institutional is the best shared class you're generally going to get. So institutional, so UNI has so much money, they get access to lower cost institutional share funds. Hawkeye doesn't have as much money, so they don't have institutional. All they have is retirement share funds. So for example, that 0.3 is the best deal they can get because they choose to invest with TIA. Now, by the way, Hawkeye, UNI, they could fire TIA. They could go get Vanguard. They just choose not to. But they could.
Not get into that fund.
At Hawkeye.
No, if we're a private individual, we could not get into that fund.
That is correct. Unless you have 200 million. And then here's John Deere. For anybody familiar with John Deere. I just want to highlight something. So John Deere has a lot of great options. Look at that 500 index at 01. Woo, it's awesome. So that's a deal that somebody worked with Fidelity. Fidelity is the provider long ago to get that kind of deal. So it's great. But there's a couple things I like to point out here. One, you see that international stock index. Anybody here work at John Deere? Okay. Well, that international stock index, while it's a great fund, 0.07, right? Great cost, that does not hold emerging markets. So don't think that you're going to buy that fund and own all the international stock outside the U.S. It only owns developed markets. So if you want to own emerging markets, you want to do that somewhere else because they don't offer a low-cost emerging markets index fund. They have a high-cost one, which you don't want. So you'd own emerging markets inside a Roth IRA or inside another old IRA. So sometimes when you see this information, you got to get in there and verify, now what is it that it owns? Just because it says, right, International Stock Index, you don't know exactly what international stocks until you get in there. Does it own developed and emerging or just one or the other? Otherwise, they have great options. Their target date funds are 0.06. They're awesome. The real estate index is awesome. Bond index, awesome. Small cap, mid is awesome. They have great options. If they had an emerging markets index, that'd be close to perfect. So that's an example where different companies have all kinds of different options. Some of them are really good. This one and McKenna. Some of them are half-ass, like you and I. And some of them are just piss poor. And it's because people have allowed the financial industry to come in and just make as much money as they possibly can off their employees. Either because people don't know any better, or because there's been kind of relationships built over time and they don't seem to care. Either way, it's not acceptable to me. Stand up for yourself if you happen to have a poor 401k. Finally, I modified my approach from last week to try to simplify what I tried to provide last week. So again, if it was me, this is how I would allocate a portfolio. Sometimes people ask me, how would you do this, Finley? So if I had 600,000 and I was going to put this together in an 80-20 mix, and in this case, I went a little bit more to bonds, a little bit less to cash, and that percentages comes out as the entire portfolio. So you add up 44, 20, and so forth, you get 100%. So that's how I personally would put together a portfolio, capturing the factor of small cap value, capturing that real estate, having the bonds in there that are negative correlated and high quality, having the cash for when I may need it, otherwise keeping most of my money in the total stock, and then keeping a decent chunk in international stock, developed and emerging. So that will keep you diversified all over the world at a cost of about 0.06% per year. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough one. So I retired 10 years ago, and I thought, you know, Finley, maybe you should consider 70-30. I couldn't do it. I wanted to, I couldn't. So for me, I'm probably going to be 80-20 for a long time. I have more concern for inflation than I do of volatility of markets. I can diversify and reduce some of that volatility. There's not much I can do about inflation other than keep a good chunk of stocks in my portfolio. So sure, for some people, you may want to reduce your stock exposure as you age, but just remind yourself, you've got to stay ahead of inflation. And volatility can be reduced, not eliminated, but it can be mitigated by having those different negative correlated asset classes within a portfolio.
So if I buy one of these 20-50 funds, like you said before, previous slides, how does that play?
Does a great job. It's going to own everything, but it's not going to own small cap value, not going to overweight, and it's not going to overweight to real estate. Otherwise, it's going to own big markets. For most people, it's going to serve you just fine. Just fine. Again, at John Deere, at UNI, they have a good target date fund. At Vanguard, they have a good target date fund. There are many target date funds out there that are not good. They're expensive. They're managed with managed funds. So be careful that you're looking at the cost when it comes to a target date fund.
Why would the money market fund, never mind. I just thought that, I guess it depends upon your
available cash, for a for somebody that account half that size, like 300,000. I kind of thought that having cash of 50,000.
Yep. Everybody's going to figure out what the right amount of cash allocation is, and that is going to change. I'll be the first to admit that. I try to keep it about 5%. And again, each person has to figure that out based on their needs at that time.
So if you have enough income, why would you have any cash in your investment portfolio at all?
Just for the possibility that something big comes out of nowhere.
No, that's all guaranteed.
No, I hear you, but something that comes out that is higher than the income coming in. And again, that may not happen. Could you pull that out of bonds or stocks based off what is up or down? Yes, you could. So could somebody not have any cash? Yes, you could. And some people do that. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but I know enough about human beings. People want some cash. I'm betting if I talk to all of you, most of you would say, Finley, I got to have some cash. I can't have all high quality bonds or stocks. So that kind of goes into the psychology of the situation.
So if you were going to take that 10% cash, where would you put it in stocks or the bonds, or you split it?
I'd put in the bonds. So I make sure that 5%, I put it all bonds. Because if I still wanted a 20% allocation.
Looking at the top two lines there, wouldn't you want to make sure anything with tax consequences like stock capital gains, would you want to make sure that's all in the retirement account?
Yeah, so those first two are very tax efficient. So in this scenario, right, everybody's different. Some people have a chunk of money outside of retirement, and the truth is most people have most of their money inside a retirement plan like a 401k. So that's just reality. But what I'm saying is those two funds at the top could be outside of retirement because they're very tax efficient if you want to hold a stock index fund out there. All very good questions. Good question. So let's finish this up. So invest with knowledge, get those allocations, get those costs just right. That risk is everything we do, right? There's risk in everything we do. We need to factor in all those types. But less risk, less return. You're trying to find the risk-adjusted return that's going to work for you. Again, it goes back to standard deviations. How can I get a decent return based on the risk that I'm taking? Look at those 5 factors, consider them. That momentum is the 6th factor that you could consider by simply looking at how you rebalance. And again, think about all these things in relation to the big picture. Don't get cute. Don't try to outsmart the market. Believe me, I'm not trying to do that. I'm simply trying to understand what's happened in the past and do what I can to squeeze out maybe a little more return without taking extra risk, so my money grows even with a little bit less volatility. Patience is required because factors run in different periods. In other words, a factor may work just fine, and then for a few years, maybe a decade, it won't. So small cap value could be a poor performing factor for a whole decade. That happens. You have to be patient through that process because that factor may work out just fine over the next 40 years. It may not work out just fine over the next 10 years. Buy and hold, right? Just what John Bogle said, this is still a buy and hold strategy. You're not trying to time anything. You're not trying to get in and get out. You decide what you want your allocations to be, you buy them, and you hold them. And the time period and the mentality of it is forever. Always account for new contributions, right? New contributions are changing your allocations ever so slightly. Always evaluate the portfolio. We've talked about this, not individual asset classes. Look at the return of the portfolio because every dog has its day. And take emotions out. As best you can, be a robot. Focus on staying rational and in a very irrational world. Back to what we've said before, be the casino. By owning a portfolio of index funds, you can be the casino. Don't be the gambler. Some books I recommend. You see that your guide to factor-based investing, it goes into some of these issues. It's up here if you want to take a look at it. Otherwise, those funds up there those books will help you through this process better understand how it all works. My story tonight is called The Purse. Once upon a time, there's this woman. She was looking for a purse that she really wanted. She went to a store and she found it. Voila. And it was $700. And she thought for a moment, she thought, oh, it's kind of expensive. So she thought she needed to go look around, see if she could find a better price for that purse. So she goes and looks at another store, and lo and behold, she finds a better price. I mean, much better, right? So it's like $125. So it's like, man. But she, you know, as much as she thinks that's a deal, maybe there's even a better deal. So she keeps looking, and lo and behold, at another store, she finds the exact same purse for $50. And she's thinking, man, I think I'm going to buy that. But she decides to sleep on it. So she comes back, and the next day she goes to look at some places just in case there's a better deal than that $50 purse. And lo and behold, she finds a purse, the same purse, for $36. And she is excited. She decides she's going to buy that purse at that moment. And as she pulls out her wallet, the person beside her saying, hey, honey, don't do it. There's a better place. There is. There's a better, that purse in over there. I know you've never heard of it, but there's a place. I'll tell you how to get there. You probably never heard of it. You can get that purse at a better cost. So she's like, well, okay, I guess that can't hurt. I can always come back here if I don't find it. So the lady tells her how to get there, and it's, you know, it's going through the woods and this, and she gets to this place. She finds it. Took a little trouble, a little effort, but she found it. She goes in the store, and she finds that purse. And that purse costs $4. $4. See, what she did was she stopped with the high-load managed mutual fund. She knew better. She got away from the 1.25 managed fund without the load. She got away from the low-cost managed fund. She got away from the high-cost index fund. She found the low-cost index fund. If we're ready to find the purse, it is there waiting for us. I'll leave you with that. Thank you, folks.